Welcome to First Chronicles, a book that opens not with action, but with memory, not with conquest, but with names, not with noise, but with quiet faithfulness preserved across generations. This is a book that slows us down and invites us to look backward so that we can move forward with clarity and purpose. It meets us after loss, after exile, after disorientation, and gently reminds us who we are by reminding us whose we are. At first glance, First Chronicles may feel unfamiliar or even challenging because it begins with long genealogies and careful records. But beneath those names is a heartbeat. This book was written to a people who had returned home from exile, people who had lived through devastation and displacement and were now standing amid ruins, asking who they were supposed to be again. Traditionally attributed to Ezra the scribe and written around the 5th century before Christ, First Chronicles retells Israel's story not to repeat the past, but to restore hope for the future. In one sentence, this book is about remembering God's faithfulness so His people can rebuild their identity, worship, and calling. First Chronicles retells Israel's history from Adam through King David, but it does so with intention. It does not focus on every failure or every political detail. Instead, it highlights God's covenant purposes, the centrality of worship, and the promise of a king through whom blessing would come. The structure itself reflects the same, moving from genealogies to the reign of David to preparations for the temple. It is history told through the lens of hope, carefully shaped to remind God's people that their story did not end with exile. Those opening genealogies are not filler. They are a declaration that every name matters. Each generation, each family line, each remembered ancestor is proof that God has not forgotten His people. In a time when identity felt fragile and the future uncertain, these names anchored Israel to a larger story. They proclaimed that God's promises had survived war, captivity, and time itself. Even when circumstances suggested abandonment, God was still keeping track. As the narrative turns toward David, First Chronicles presents him not as a flawless hero, but as a chosen king whose heart was oriented toward God. The chronicler emphasizes David's role in uniting the people, establishing Jerusalem, and preparing for the temple, even though he would not build it himself. David's life here becomes a picture of obedience, repentance, and devotion. His reign reminds us that leadership in God's kingdom is not about power, but about alignment with God's purposes. One of the strongest themes in First Chronicles is worship. The book gives careful attention to musicians, singers, gatekeepers, priests, and Levites. Worship is not treated as a side activity, but as the center of national life. Praise, thanksgiving, and reverence are presented as essential responses to who God is. Through this emphasis, the book teaches that restoration begins not with rebuilding walls, but with reorienting hearts toward God. First Chronicles reveals a God who was faithful across generations, attentive to detail, and deeply invested in relationship with His people. He is shown as the covenant-keeping God who honors obedience, responds to humility, and delights in worship offered with sincerity. Even when His people fail, His purposes continue. Even when leaders fall, His promises stand. This book assures us that God's plans are larger than any single moment of success or failure. This story also points us forward to Jesus. The genealogies that feel so distant are part of the same lineage that ultimately leads to Christ. David's kingship foreshadows a greater king, one whose reign would be eternal. The emphasis on temple preparation points beyond stone and structure to a time when God would dwell not in a building, but among His people through His Son. Jesus fulfills the hope that First Chronicles carefully preserves, becoming the true Son of David and the ultimate expression of God's faithfulness. For modern believers, First Chronicles speaks into seasons of rebuilding, transition, and quiet faithfulness. It reminds us that our lives are not isolated moments, but chapters in a much larger story. When we feel unseen, God remembers. When we feel small, God values faithfulness. When we wonder whether our worship matters, this book answers with a resounding yes. It calls us to live with purpose, to honor God with our gifts, and to trust that He is at work even when progress feels slow. As you begin this book, listen for the rhythm of remembrance and hope. Allow the names, the songs, and the preparations to shape your understanding of God's heart. Let this story remind you that you are part of something enduring, something sacred, something guided by a faithful God who keeps His promises across generations. Open your heart to worship, root yourself in God's story, and step forward knowing that He is not finished yet. This is day 105. This is First Chronicles, and this is His time. Every day, all year.